Welcome to NycosRPG, and this is Game Master's Soapbox. Welcome to the show, and we will get started just as soon as I clear my camera. There we go, much better. Alrighty, I've changed the angle and approach to it, make it a little bit easier for me to connect with you, maybe by actually looking at the camera instead of looking up into down at the screen or up in the space. So we're going to try something a little different today. We're going to focus all of our specific portions to the specifics of role-playing as a game master. And so we're going to start with how to start up a role-playing group, how to maintain a role-playing group over time, how to support a role-playing group once it's operational, and how to avoid being that guy in a group when you're actually playing. So the last one's a little bit player related, but it's still focusing on the operation of a games group. Today's rant is going to be the challenge of game life crossover, and talk about some of the nuances in both directions, how sometimes the game floods into reality and sometimes reality floods into the game, and how to navigate that properly. And also, when we close out tonight, I'm also going to remind you of the way to get a free copy of the Dark Shard system book, absolutely free, for and that'll come up at the end of the show today. And beyond that, I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't know whether or not we're going to have a lot of conversations, or whether it's going to once again be an hour-long monologue. But we'll see how that goes. So we've had some success in the last couple of episodes where people have come in and I've been able to start some of a dialogue, and so we tend to run a little bit long when that happens. So although we're slated to be here about an hour, we may be here longer. Who knows? So right off the bat, we're going to be starting off with how to start a role-playing group. Well, first of all, you'd have to have an understanding of a role-playing game, and sometimes it happens consciously, where you've decided that you're going to pick up this new hobby. Sometimes it happens by accident, when somebody perceives that you might like a product and they've provided it to you. Sometimes it's foisted on you by players who happen to think you're more organized than they are and want you to actually start running the game. So in any case where you're going to start a role-playing group, the first thing is to realize that it is a possibly sequential event. In other words, role-playing games can start and end within a time period of the game as planned. But from my experience with almost 50 years behind the screen as a game master, I can tell you that the majority of times the session that ends will end with a incomplete story. In other words, there will be something left out, something that didn't get resolved, something that could have happened beyond the end of the story. And these kinds of things can happen for a myriad of different reasons. But just realize, therefore, that when you start a role-playing game, it's sort of more than a commitment to a single session. Role-playing games don't have the benefit of a winning condition. There's no conclusion that is reached within a session normally. And so therefore, with a longer term potential ending, it's difficult to assume that your first session will be your only session. So most players, when they start into it, already have the idea that will be the case. But I do want to mention it because there are people who literally buy the product off the shelf and assume that, like any other board game or any other tabletop game, that it will, end when it ends, and that will be the conclusion. And that's it. Built in, it's not set up for that to be the purpose or the means of operations, because as a role-playing story, it also tends to be a story-building story. So the persons that are engaged in the actual playing the game are the ones that are driving the story, and so as they get excited and involved and progress the story, then the story becomes richer, more full, and there's more details that can be pursued. Therefore, just realize that the first thing you have to worry about on starting a role-playing group is that it is somewhat of a time commitment. Now, that actually is a double-edged sword because while it is a time commitment, it's also a time commitment. And what I mean by that is, generally speaking, it takes a couple hours to start rolling for your first session, and usually it can take a couple of extra hours afterwards to debrief, decompress, and resolve anything that may have happened in game that either causes concern or makes people ask questions. So the idea that a role-playing game, when you're setting the time for it, you do set aside at least 3 or 4 hours for the participation in the game. Perhaps you've got a longer term event going on. I know people that have started their campaign literally at a dinner party where the storyteller happens to mutter that he's already finished getting prepared, and the players all say, "Well, why not?" And so you start late in the evening, and you're playing until really early in the morning. That happens sometimes. When you start a role-playing group, realize that the players are generally going to play the same character week over week and session over session, and this can go on ad infinitum based on what you as the game master have put together for the players. The second thing to consider, besides just the timing of the role-playing session, is the material requirements. There are character sheets that are required, which also means you'll have to have writing utensils, unless everybody's doing it on their phones, which is of course possible as well. But they've got to have an access to a character sheet. If they have an access to the character sheet, they're also going to need an access to the rules systems, whichever game system you're using, to be able to build out the material data that is their player character. So for clarification, when you start a role-playing game, and I've not gone into it specifically, I'll have to do this in a later video, but the different roles of the players participating in a role-play game are basically threefold. You have the primary storyteller, who is the game master, and it's his responsibility to produce the framework of the story, outline and determine what the encounters are going to be, and then to adjudicate them. There's a second role, if you will, of the note taker, and that's the person who is keeping track of the things that are being created so that the players and the game master have a continuity session after session, week over week. And then the third are the just simple actors, and that's the participants who simply provide the entertainment for themselves and for the game master by taking on the roles within the stories. All of these things, therefore, lead to the roleplay. Pardon me. There we go. The roleplay experience being participated with by different people doing different things in the game. So that's the second thing you have to have is that awareness. And the third thing that you need to have is a play area. If you've watched any of the videos online of roleplay groups, almost always they are seated around a single table, and they're along the edges and they interact across that space. There are groups that use miniature setups and have dioramas set up on the tabletop, and then they utilize miniatures moving through that space inch by inch, resolving whatever conflicts they run into over that space. And so if you're going to have a play area like that, you have to take that into consideration. Many times I've played in groups where we sit around in the living room and everybody's got a little hand tablet or a writing pad or whatever, and we play simply theater of the mind, which means the game occurs in the mental space created by the players and the game master to describe the action, and there isn't required any miniatures or anything. It's all done by perceptual understanding. Arguably, there's more conversation, therefore more back and forth about what's physically there and what the dimensions are and such, but it increases the adaptability to the group to multiple situations, which we will talk about in other sessions, whether it be they walk off the edge of your map or they head off in a direction that you didn't expect or whatever. Final thing about doing a starting of a roleplay group is you want to have something usually considered to be a session zero. And by that, I mean the players will bring their characters as they've already built them out or build them on the spot, and the game master will coordinate with them the facts and the realities that those characters will be experiencing at the beginning of the actual game. Since most games are set in a fantastic setting with a world that is different than the one we live in, different from the one we live in, then the requirements for that advanced knowledge are basically a demand for session 0. The more your world is like the current world we live in, the easier that becomes. But then that becomes more problematic because where are the lines? Where did the different cultures come from? Whatever. And so when you do your session 0, you have to find more ways to be inventive on how those things came to be and where precisely you are, not only geographically, but also temporally. At what period, what technologies are allowed, what types of medicines are supported, and that kind of thing. So once you've all done all of that and you have your session 0, then you're ready to rock and roll and start your role-playing group campaign story sequence. And I've gone into that somewhat in a couple of other videos, and we can go further onto that in a different point. But the point is that starting the role-playing group and getting ready to go on the adventures is itself an undertaking. So kind of plan out and project what you want to do to accomplish that in order to be effective at starting it. Now, when it comes to maintaining a role-playing group, obviously one of the things that comes in is going to be the scheduling. Are you going to be playing once a week, once a month, once a day? How often are you going to get together? That's really important to schedule out, because schedules in today's world seem to be so hectic and crazy. There's no way to know how long somebody's going to stick around, how long they're going to be able to play for that specific session, time of start, time of ending. All these things come into it. So the first thing to develop is a schedule. And that schedule usually means you also want to develop some form of group communication. One of my recommendations is a service like Discord, where you can create a play space that is virtual, but it's also something that can be tangibly used for communication, such as having at least a text channel for the players to keep notes and contact each other, but also to have perhaps a voice channel in case you're not able to meet each other face to face, and you can still host an event or play virtually through just that simple voice communication. This process of building that also gives an opportunity for additional information to be shared with the players in between sessions that will help to amplify their experience, get them more excited about the world they live in, and provide them with additional information that can be used in game once you're back together. So maintenance of a role-playing group is just like maintenance of any kind of a community. You want to be able to know that the people you're talking with are getting the information, and they are staying in communication with you and providing you with feedback on how effective the information is getting to them. Furthermore, in my case, I run many different RPGs, and I do many of them online, and so my channels are either arbitrarily open or closed depending on what the group that are playing want. And so to maintain a role-playing group, mainly you have to concern yourself with what the players desire. I have sessions that are absolutely private. The game folder is not searchable or not accessible to anybody who's not in the group. This allows them to carry on conversations even about game event things that don't have anything to do with the role-play environment, but they also can have information that is private to their group, and therefore the groups, if you will, can decide when that information is shared from one to the other. Most of my groups have an open folder simply because my approach to world building includes a more expansive ideation of player involvement. So the general information that players share from one group to each other is perfectly accessible to the players from my standpoint if that information is of a general nature. In other words, discovering, for example, that the trolls on Nikos are not the green-skinned regenerators that you expect when you think of the term troll was kind of an eye-opener for two of my groups, because they had never run into a troll and still held the assumption that it was like trolls on any other planet, any other system. And yet my players were able to share that information one group to another because they actually fought that group and had communications through written forms before. So yes, in the world of Nikos, there's a sort of primitive communications process, which I'll go into at a later time. I created it specifically to be kind of a clever joke, but over time it became a useful tool, so they still remain. The next thing to do with maintaining a role-playing group is keep a calendar. And by this, I mean players often are not aware of things that are going on in each other's lives. But if you maintain a group calendar, then you would know, for example, when someone's birthday is coming up, somebody's anniversary is coming up, somebody's children's recitals coming up or whatever. And while that doesn't seem like it would be pertinent to the group, nonetheless, it's really important when it comes to the scheduling aspect. If you know that a person's birthday happens to fall on games day, you can be conscientious of that and be aware either the player might be away from the group or they may want to do something special on that day. So being aware of the calendar and keeping that up to date is a useful tool as well. And it really helps to maintain the continuity of the group. Another thing about maintaining a role-playing group is to make sure that you find a way to maintain the players themselves week over week. If a player is feeling somehow disenfranchised or disconnected or aloof from the group, they may feel a inclination to quit playing or to change groups. So it's important for the groups to maintain a heartbeat on each other, so that they can check in and see how the players are coping and handling what's going on and whether or not they're getting enough game time and such. And these kind of open communications are really useful in maintaining the group over time. The final thing that I would recommend under maintaining a role-playing group is maintain the calendar, not only from the player's standpoint of their schedules and such, but on a larger scale, if you're running a campaign that's going to last a year or more, you certainly might want to keep track of notes of what happens in game at different points in time, and perhaps let the players, let the characters in the story react to the anniversaries of their activities. And this may be a little harder in many cases because the games groups might, wave off actually adventuring for a week in favor of staying in a town and being supported while they're doing some training or whatever. But the elements here are that the players and the characters both have lives and schedules, and so being able to honor either and both of them really help to maintain the role-playing group. I found also that creating a name for the adventuring team, the group, whatever you want to call them, for them to have an identity as a collective, something that they are a part of, really helps to maintain the continuity, because week over week you want to know what's happening with that group. So if you don't actually create it externally, such as somebody who hires them and gives them a name, be really open to and receptive of any game that the group comes up with. I've got my Monday campaign calls itself the Bucket Brigade. And while they did at least once fight a fire using buckets, their real angle on that title is that each character in their pre-play backstories had some association with a form of a bucket or a pail, depending on which person. And so therefore, since they had that in common, it became the group's name. So by having a group name, then they have an identity, and when they have a group identity, then the players can rally behind it or stand up to defend it, as the case may be. And it really helps to make sure they feel that belonging and ownership that makes wanting to be a part of a role-playing game critically important. Okay, how to support a role-play group? Well, role-playing does require some mechanical things, one of which is snacks. And in certain cases, groups have decided that they want a club-like structure where each party member or person as part of the group supports through economics a certain number of dollars per week to make sure that there are plenty of snacks at the table. Others instead bring their favorite snacks to share with others. And this has been really, really effective with some of our groups, because the idea that each person contributes what they can really takes some of the pressure off, but it also at the same time creates the urgency of working together, so that if somebody brings pizza one week, then somebody else is going to maybe buy a couple of bags of tacos or something. But the idea is that you support the role-playing group through mutual support in things like that. A second is to support a role-playing group in the case of your game master may have 2 or 3 other tasks or jobs during the week, and I've had many conversations about whether or not a game master should be paid for his work. But if you support your game master, even if you're not doing the show through a financial means, at least, for example, if he is doing special events, make sure you can attend if you can, support the storytellers in those fashions. If players, I've got one of my players in a group is a musician and does performances in the community sometimes, so finding out when they're going to be playing or whatever, then I make sure to support their actions as a member of the group. It doesn't even necessarily mean that I like the music type that they like, but I'm showing my support for the players in the group by being there in that support role. Other ways of supporting is maybe you're going to be able to host it, have it at your own house, or maybe you can coordinate for where the group's going to meet, and that's one way to support. Another is to have conversations that are not game related about non-game materials from time to time, so that you are building the community of your role-play group, not just coming together for the game session. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing it that way, but the idea of being supportive enhances the identity and the connection between the players and the game master and each other. So finally, support can also be in written form, literary form. I can tell you that a dozen or so of my players have requested letters of recommendation for their employment on the basis of how well they did in playing the game together. Because we've talked before, and I constantly stomp on the value of role-playing games in, quote, real life. But having the ability to say, yes, this person has come to every session for 3 years and was an exemplary player and a team leader, and all. I mean, the information you can support them with is really useful, and that's whether you're doing so as the game master or not. I mean, if you've got a group player that you've worked with and he asks for, or he's going to look for new employment, suggest that you write him a letter of recommendation or a friend of the court brief, or whatever you want to call it. The point is that you can support the community of players directly or indirectly. And this is important for the expansion of the hobby, because when you are able to show that your community of role-play gamers is something that includes more than just the play sessions, you're enhancing the perception and the acceptance of role-play gaming in common culture as well. So, all right, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk about players for a moment, and this subject's rather kind of a touchy place. And I know that many game masters have gotten to the point where they've got to handle that guy in the group. Sometimes it's a matter of intensity. The person's social skills are not up to par. He doesn't know what the idea of boundaries are. He hasn't established any concept of what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. Maybe he is insensitive to other people's physical reactions, so he's not even aware that he's being that guy. But in any of these cases, the game master ultimately gets handed the objective of dealing with that guy. And so we're going to talk about a couple of different versions of that guy, because I don't want to single any person out, even in ancient or recent memory, but I want to talk about a few different ones. And the first kind of that guy that's particularly difficult to deal with is that person who has decades of roleplay experience and an expectation of how games should play, and an awareness of the specific rule system that the play is going on in, such that he is as much, if not more, of an authority than the storyteller. Now, even in a case like mine, where I've been a game master for 50 plus years, there are people who know some games more than I do, in terms of the mechanics and in terms of even the lore. And having to deal with somebody who can undermine or overthrow the position of a game master in a discussion of rules or a discussion of canon lore is problematic. Not only does it undermine the game master's personal stake as the authority figure, but it also challenges the very structure of roleplay games. If one player can contest, why can't they all? If one player has access to information, why can't they all? And these leveraging of positions that occur under that kind of that guy are difficult at best and impossible at the worst. When you are dealing with somebody who is actually playing your game but knows as much or as nearly as much as you do, and in certain cases perhaps more than you do in the mechanics of the game that you're playing, it's best to find a way to ally yourself with that person in most cases, because that guy is going to support you when you make mistakes, because you also acknowledged when you weren't making mistakes, and he acknowledged that as well. So there's, for a while, that can handle most of that guy's situation, because you can placate by acknowledging. But the second kind of that guy is simply the person who has little or no social skills. He's in an environment where he's with people that are unfamiliar to him, that are not aware of his limitations, and therefore he has to be kind of reined in over time by either the game master or the other players. And this one, believe it or not, actually is easier to deal with, because the awareness of the person's overt behavior becomes obvious pretty quickly. So even a brand new player who's being engaged with by that guy persona is able to see through that bluntness and perhaps be able to accept it and understand it better. In the case of that guy's situation, often it's simply a matter of speaking with them, drawing attention to it, and providing them with specific key phrases that will remind them that they're over the edge and bring them back into line. Now, there are those who would say, well, in the case of any person that's that guy, he should be gotten rid of. He's a poison to the games community, and he's a danger to new players. Not necessarily physically a danger, but he's going to endanger their ability to play the game evenly and coherently through time if they see him being treated in a special way. But the aspect of the that guy syndrome is that the that guy syndrome, I believe, and this has probably been my downfall over years, I believe that it can be overcome if that person doesn't have their own agenda. I haven't gone through it since the beginning of the Soapbox, but I've got a theory that I go through from time to time that has to do with the types of people there are in the world, and it quantifies them into general terms. And part of that is the idea that there is someone who does not mean to do evil, but they intend to be evil. And I don't mean that in the context of a bad person. I'm referring to that as they want to undermine what's been created or where the creation is going. They want to undercut the value of the awards and prizes that the players receive during the game. They want to overshadow and embarrass the players that act in ways that they don't find acceptable and such like. And the reality is that that guy in the games group, in my experience, has almost always ended up being either let go from the group, in other words, the game master or someone else has told them they're no longer welcome to play, or they withdraw actively because they're not getting the experience they want from the game. And they're both equally egregious. It's not a situation where if they are told to leave, they are the bad person, and if the game is left, they're the good person. It may be a whole spectrum, but the handling of that guy really comes down to the type and the position of the encounter and how best to navigate around it. And while it can be done for a period of time with just about anyone, there are certain egregious things that can happen wherein it has to be stopped. If the person that is that guy becomes somewhat of a bully and he's starting to press his opinions over the opinions of others, if he's undermining other players' decisions and belittling them for the method that they came to achieve that decision, if the player becomes rude and insulting, in any of these cases, the game has to be brought back online in a fair way, and generally that means that that guy has to be dealt with in one way or another. And most of the time, the fixes that are temporary don't seem to have a long-term application, and those that have a long-term application have been to the point of breaking up even friendships. So it's a horrible place to be, to have that guy in your group, but with 50 years of experience behind me, I can say in confidence that every group will from time to time have that guy. And so just be aware that the handling of that should be done by the game master because he's the one who's administering the game, and that the players who are not that guy can be as supportive as they can be, but they also have to acknowledge when the lines have been crossed. So, alrighty. Now we'll go to the rant. And the rant's not really that much of a rant, more of a statement. And that is that when you have a game session that only plays out once a week, or only once a month, or whatever, periodically, when you have just that time set apart for the game event, try to keep the game event in that time frame. As a formerly married person, I was married for more than 20 years, and the issues that caused the divorce weren't directly tied to games, but nonetheless, the idea of letting the game spill over into reality, or some of the reality spill over into the game, is absolutely natural, but it's also to be avoided like the plague if possible. The games, by definition, are a fantasy. They are not reality. They should happen in a place where your mind is and heart are in a good place, that's positive energy and enjoying yourself and appreciating each other's company. And last week we talked a bit about inter-party conflict, and it does happen from time to time, but generally what I'm talking about here is just normal life and how sometimes it can cross over. I had a friend of mine who owned a trucking company, and several weeks in a row, his drivers caused problems that made him run late for getting home, and so therefore he was never prepared for the beginning of the game session. And not only am I talking about he didn't have his character sheet all prepped out and ready to go, he would come in with a very poor attitude and a very grumpy demeanor, and would interact not only with the non-player characters, but with the actual players in the group in an adverse way, simply because he had all this negative energy that he hadn't been able to process before he started playing. So the challenge of the game life crossover has to do with how much the reality is going to adversely affect your game, or conversely, how much the activities in the game could adversely affect reality. I have a particular situation I remember where a player was in their mind thinking they were saving the other player by placing the persona, the actual character, inside of a bag of holding. Well, those of you that understand the physics of a bag of holding from role-playing games, the idea of an extra dimensional space is that it has a very, very limited amount of oxygen. And this person left the second person inside of the bag arguably longer than should have been allowed. And therefore the player was panicking because they knew that in such a case they should be dying inside that space. And it was so frustrating that when the game session was over, it was so buggy that when the game session was over, the players actually carried that over into the parking lot and into the next day at work and a couple of days after that. And by the following week, I had to make a judgment and call them both down for it, because it was adversely affecting the group as a whole, and the possibility of the group not wanting to even be together was tied to the fact that crossover had occurred. So holding back and keeping the things that are in your real life out of the game is critical, but just so the actions in the game, no matter how simplistic they might be, can be adverse to the game. So the final piece of the challenge of the in-game life crossover is the almost desire to look at things that happen in the real world through the lens of a role player. I remember when I was a youngster, I say youngster, I was in my 20s, my buddies and I would talk about whether or not that police officer or that movie character would have thus and such as an armor class and would have this many hit points and what level they might be, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all things that are kind of cute and charming, whatever, but bringing them out of the real world and bringing them out of the game fiction fantasy place and into the real world can have negative conflict issues. And in my case, it was that my spouse was like tired of the game stuff being involved in our conversation, to the point where she actually shouted down my group of friends, telling them to, stop talking about such nonsense. And she went so far as to call them underachieving losers. Now, the point at which she said it, there were some facts that were true. Fact, everyone in the room at that moment was unemployed. Fact, everybody in that room, for the most part, had a degree or a specialization of skill that put them where they had been. Fact, everyone in that room, with the exception of myself at that point, had a degree. And so for her to come into a group of college-trained students, of which all of them were at that instant unemployed, it would seem almost pertinent. But these are the folks that within a week or two would go on to have $30,000 to $50,000 a year starting jobs. And her comment was that they were the underachieving losers. And it actually stuck. That ended up being the name of that group. When I talked earlier about a group having having a colloquial name. Underachieving losers is what they called themselves, which was kind of disparaging and self-deprecating, but was also rather funny. So the main point of this rant is that you have to keep those separated. You need to be able to differentiate reality from fantasy. Obviously, in world environment things you have to, but even in terms of understanding when a game is being played and when a game is not is kind of important. So, well, now I'll get off the soapbox. So, how do you get a free copy of the Dark Shard system book? Well, every week on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. Pacific, I am going to be running a roleplay game through a website called startplaying.games. Look at the header and make sure I got that right. Startplaying.games. And my name is Jonathan G. Albin, and you can find me as a game master on there. And you can also do a search for the game sessions, and there is a free NycosRPG game session slated for every Saturday, starting on the 3rd and going forward. And that game will run from 10 till noon, and those persons who sign up for it and join my Patreon will receive a free copy of the PDF of the rules of Nykos's Dark Shards, which is the first of the role-playing books that I've come out with. And that PDF includes virtually everything you need to run a fantasy RPG, with the understanding that you're bringing with you your ample imagination, and the rules are going to be fundamentally what you need from the book. So you can certainly come and play tomorrow without the book. It's not required to be a player. And we're going to be playing through Discord, and the Discord channel is available through the Twitch channel, and I believe it's also through the YouTube channel. But if you want additional information about the games and about the world of Nykos, check out our Patreon account at Nykos. It's at patreon.com/Nykos. If you want to know more about the product itself and want to purchase a copy, you can get to the PDF at NycosRPG.com, which is my website. And if you want to learn more about being a game master, you can, of course, go to games.official.academy and join the NycosRPG Roleplay Academy. So with that, I am going to be signing off for the evening. I want to thank you all for your participation. I do want to call out our game store sponsor, right down there in the corner, Board Game Paradise in Redlands, California. I run live games on Mondays and Tuesdays at that location. So if you're in the Southern California area and want to play in the world of Nykos and in my game sessions, both Monday and Tuesday start at 6 p.m. Pacific. And all you need to do is talk to the owner, and they'll tell you where we're meeting and all of that. And Board Game Paradise is a full-service game store covering every category and style of games imaginable. And literally, if they don't have it in store, they can get a hold of anything pretty much that's available. So again, thank you for your participation in this. If you like what this show is representing, make sure you like and follow the show. If you didn't care for the content, thank you nonetheless for the amount of time you spent watching, and I appreciate that. If you are a fan of the show, make sure you share this link for the Twitch channel. We're here every night at 11 p.m. and I hope to see you guys all tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much. This is Jonathan Albin, Game Master J, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.